Hello and welcome to Curator with a Camera. I'm Anthony Coulls and today we're at the Ulster Transport Museum to look at Dunluce Castle. Get you back into it! You may wonder why we're here at the Ulster Transport Museum looking at the railways of Northern Ireland and the U2 class loco in particular. Well, it's because the railways of Northern Ireland are inextricably linked with mainland Great Britain, and especially so the story of the Northern Counties Committee. So in the 19th century, early 20th century, the Midland Railway were seeking to expand their operations. They'd just invested heavily in new docks at Heysham, but were looking to expand their empire further across the Irish Sea. In Northern Ireland there was a very successful railway company, the Belfast and Northern Counties Railway, and the Midland Railway sought to buy them out. In 1903 they acquired the majority of shares and the Midland Railway Northern Counties Committee was born. So whilst it was still Midland Railway with the ownership of the shares, it was run pretty much autonomously by a committee based in Belfast. The Northern Counties Committee under the Midland Railway carried on until the grouping of 1923, when, as the Midland Railway on the mainland became part of the London Midland and Scottish Railway, so the Midland Railway Northern Counties Committee became LMS NCC. That carried on operating quite happily and successfully until 1948, but of course what happens in 1948 in mainland Britain? The railways were nationalised. You had the formation of British Railways. But how does that work in Northern Ireland? Well, the NCC passed to the British Transport Commission. The Northern Counties Committee was sold to the new Ulster Transport Authority. It meant a change of livery, it meant a change of operations, it meant a change of business ways, because no longer was it part of private enterprise, but again it was something that was national. And as with British Railways, the Ulster Transport Authority had changes to make and the railway to modernise. And UTA eventually became Northern Ireland Railways, and Translink, as we now see just outside the hall here at Coultraw, with the main line running right past the door. But Dunluce Castle, what of it itself? Let's go and have a look and see. Dunluce Castle was one of 18 locomotives of the U2 class. Built in 1924, this one in particular and 6 of its sisters were built by the North British Locomotive Company in Glasgow. They look very similar to the LMS 440 locomotives on the mainland, but that's as much as the similarity goes. They are mechanically very different to the 2Ps and the locomotives that had gone before that of the Midland Railway and became part of LMS. So the look with that glorious crimson lake is very synonymous with the LMS, but the actual mechanics of the machine, as we'll see shortly, are very different. The 18 locomotives were the most numerous of the engines of the NCC until the early 1930s, when the WT class came in after that. Initially they were express engines, and they ran to Derry, London Derry and Portrush and all over. But latterly, once the WTs came in, they were a lot more on commuter lines, but still fast passenger trains. They were pretty much go anywhere, do anything. Not really goods engines per se, but they could be put to all sorts of work, very versatile engines. And the 440 is a classic wheel arrangement, and we'll see that as we walk past the engine, and really quite unremarkable, except the finish of these engines, certainly the ones that were built by North British. They were always said by the enginemen to have that little bit of edge over them. The drivers took a little bit more pride in them, and they called them the Scotch engines. The finish was just that little bit more. Other engines in the class were made at York Road Works by the NCC themselves, or rebuilt from earlier locomotives. So there are little differences between a number of them. But the 7 Scotch engines were all named after Irish castles, Dunluce Castle, of course, being but one of them. That glorious LMS Crimson Lake livery only lasted until the war, when the engines were painted in black, and then when they were sold to the Ulster Transport Authority, the black continued with red and yellow lining. Quite smart, but really utilitarian compared to the glorious livery that we see Dunluce Castle with today. Throughout the 1950s, once the UTA began to work through a programme of modernisation, very much as British Railways were doing on the mainland, the U2s became surplus to requirements and began to be taken out of service from the mid-1950s. Dunluce Castle itself was the very last of the U2s in service, working until 1962, and upon withdrawal it was selected for preservation and restored to this glorious Crimson Lake livery, that LMS red which is so beloved by enthusiast historians and really marked the railway out as being something very special indeed. And the engine was taken to the then Belfast Transport Museum in Witham Street, and then in the 1990s it was moved by rail here to Coultraw, where it is indeed the pride of the collection. But enough of its general background, let's go and have a look and see what makes it tick. Starting at the front of the Loco, the first thing that we actually need to talk about is the track itself, the width of the track gauge, because here in Northern Ireland and across Ireland itself, the track gauge is 5 feet and 3 inches, not the Stevensonian gauge that we know of 4 feet 8.5. And why is that? Well, when the railways were a new thing in Ireland, there were all sorts of different gauges. There was even 6 foot 2 inches, which you think about Brunel and the broad gauge of 7 feet and 1/4 inch. Standardisation was a really important thing because moving goods, moving people requires something that is standard, that is across everywhere, because transshipment of goods is timely, it's costly, it's awkward, it takes up far too many resources. So to have a gauge that is the same across your railway network is really important. Now, in the 1840s, the Board of Trade stipulated 4 feet 8.5 inches was to be the standard gauge on the mainland, but the Board of Trade specified in Ireland that the gauge was to be 5 feet 3 inches. So whilst the Loco looks very much like an engine from the mainland, it's not. But there we are, 5 foot 3 inches of gauge. But the front end of it, as we said in our initial history, looks very much like a standard Midland Railway, LMS Railway 440. This classic lines of it, that Crimson Lake livery that I keep gushing about, it's just a lovely looking engine. But the details on it, you know, the Midland Railway and LMS, the 2P that people have compared these engines to, never had the smoke box, dart and wheel there. They had locking lugs around the outside of the smoke box. You can see there the signs of this engine's working life there. A patch that's been put on the front smoke box door ring there, and another patch up above. These engines earned their crust. They worked very hard for over 30 years as first off the express runners, and they still ran very hard and fast on the commuter trips. The chimney at the top, again, a very classic LMS Midland design with the capuchon at the front. That's very much, that's like the little crown, the little cowl at the front of it. Some of these engines later had what was called the Stanier pattern chimney on the top, replacing the Fowler pattern, and it was said that they didn't steam quite as well as the engines with that fitting. Coming down the side of the smoke box, there's our works plate there, North British Locomotive Company of Glasgow, Queen's Park Works, and there's its works number and the date 1924. It was said that the North British Company built locomotives. You could say diamonds were forever. That engine has survived all this time now, and there it is. The diamond is indeed forever whilst it's here in the museum. Our smoke box itself, slightly longer than you'd expect necessarily. You can see the smoke box saddle starts there and goes up. Slightly longer smoke box to accommodate the superheaters, and you look at the film on element lines and we talk about superheaters. There would be a superheater header up inside the smoke box. There is a large pipe coming in along the side, the vacuum ejector pipe to work the ejector for the vacuum brakes, the exhaust going straight into the smoke box and up the chimney. But what else do we have as we walk along past Dunluce Castle? Four-wheel bogie at the front, part of that 440 design, 440 wheel arrangement, and perhaps that's something we should look at in a future Curator with a camera, how the different wheel arrangements manifest themselves. But here, inside the frames, this is where the magic happens. This is the inside motion for the locomotive. So the two cylinders are mounted together underneath the smoke box, in that smoke box saddle, with the piston valves on top of them, actuated by this valve gear. Now, for an engine from 1924, this valve gear inside the frames is what's called the Walschaertz valve gear. That you'll see that same valve gear, the type of valve gear, on Duchess of Hamilton, on Mallard, on Flying Scotsman, on Ellerman lines. It's very simple. It cuts down the number of moving parts. Quite often on an engine of this type you would expect to see Stevenson valve gear between the frames, very traditional, but here we have the Walschaertz valve gear, Guy de Walschaertz, and he created that system, and you can see that going through. And then behind the valve gear down to the crank axle itself, driven by the pistons from the cylinders underneath the smoke box. So coming right back to this first axle here, this first wheel set is the crank axle, and the engine's cylinders drive directly onto that. The reversing gear operated by a lever within the cab, which we shall see coming down through this way shaft there with the fulcrum, and it's lifting and lowering the links there, so you can set the engine into forward or backwards gear. Walking along the boiler and the rest of the loco, there's that glorious, wonderfully curved shaped nameplate there, Dunluce Castle, and really quite something very special to have named locomotives. Always gave them that little bit of a celebrity status, and the pride again for the enginemen, keep their locos clean, looking after them and making sure they're there, but also giving the engine something in the public eye. You know, we were pulled by Dunluce Castle today, behold our train, wasn't it great? Looking back down to the wheels, we can certainly see that by the time of withdrawal, the UTA had their money's worth out of the brakes. You see the brake blocks here quite worn. The brake block acts on the tyre of the wheel, but you can see there the wear pattern as the block has come round onto the wheel. And there also our sanding gear coming down, actuated from the cab, steam sanding, dropping sand down with steam pressure, helping under the wheels there to give us a grip in damp or greasy rail conditions. Both driven wheel sets have the sanders. There's the sandbox for the trailing wheel set coming round, and again the steam jet, there would have been another pipe coming down there feeding steam in. Another quite worn brake block also. But this very classic LMS Midland Railway shape. The Belpaire firebox for steam raising, the pipework and the handrail going down the side for the ejector, and then up on the cab side itself, the very famous London Midland and Scottish Railway crest. You wouldn't necessarily expect to see that on engine in Northern Ireland, but with the history of the Northern Counties Committee, that's how it was. The LMS stamped their identity in Northern Ireland on the locos. Here is its number plate, 74, in that glorious Gaelic script, really quite attractive, I think, but also giving it that bit of identity as a Northern Irish loco. But then something else on the side of the cab that we've not encountered in anything in our collection. And in fact, we don't have anything at the National Railway Museum that has this apparatus fitted to the side of the cab. Now, if you watch the Curator with a Camera on the Talyllyn Railway Dolgoch or the Signalling School, well, I don't want to watch that one. The Signalling School video that we've made, we talk about single lines, we talk about tokens and the ability to run on a single line once you're in possession of a particular token or tablet giving you that authority to proceed along that piece of line. And as you've seen, if you watch the Talyllyn one, we stop and exchange the tokens. Now, quite often that was done on the move, and the fireman would lean out from the cab and exchange the tokens with the signalman on the platform or on the ground. Now, if your engine's running quite fast, that's quite a feat to do, because it requires coordination, and if you get it wrong, you either break your arm or you drop the token, or both, which is slightly embarrassing and a little bit career limiting. So what we have on the side here of this locomotive is a tablet catching, token catching apparatus that could be lowered by this handle here out from the side of the engine, so that this arm would then drop down, and it could both pick up and drop a token or a tablet from a line side apparatus. That meant you didn't have to slow the train down to do the token exchange. You could do a token exchange at, let's say, 45, 50 miles an hour, and you knew you were going to have that token with you. You didn't break your fireman's arm, you didn't break the signalman's arm, you didn't drop it in the ballast. This apparatus, which is fitted on both sides of the engine on single line track, enabled you to pick up the token and drop it off safely and securely, time after time. But they most importantly shortened journey times by maybe a fraction of seconds, but it's all important that you didn't need to decelerate and accelerate away from a token exchange. It was able to be done on the move. Dunluce Castle does indeed, from this angle, look to all intents and purposes like an LMS 2P class, but really it's superficial. That's where the similarity ends. This has 6-foot driving wheels, the boiler pressures are different, but it does look like a classic LMS loco. And it was a classic LMS loco, but for the Northern Counties Committee. Let's go and have a look around the other side and see what else we can see. Now, as we walk up to the back of Dunluce Castle, there's our man, we're getting his back into it. Have you not finished yet? No, he's not saying very much today. There's that lovely tender number plate, the vacuum bag on the back, the vacuum hose, screw coupling and the steam heat fitting. Sort of things that we've seen on so many Curators with a Camera. But here's our tender, a Fowler pattern tender, so whilst the engine itself has those similarities but isn't, this is a complete and utter LMS pattern Fowler tender, which you will see on locomotives like the Crab and Midland Compound and so many other engines. And here on this side of the cab is also our single line apparatus that we talked about and looked at. Just while we're walking along the side of it, a little bit higher up here, we can see on top of that firebox there the two safety valves, Ross Pop safety valves there, classic shaped dome, and our Fowler pattern chimney there with that capuchon on the front, which the crews always reckoned was slightly better. It gave the engines a better steaming ability than when they were fitted with Stanier pattern chimneys. Further, the handrail down the side. Here's a really good view from up alongside the running plate of the inside motion for the loco. So between the frames we can see the two large cylinders at the front with the slide bars along here. The piston rods coming out from those cylinders, connecting to the crosshead, which is just there, and then down through the connecting rod connecting that crosshead to the crank axle, which we can see here. 2 cylinders drive, quite smooth motion there, and there is the very large balance weight on the way shaft for the reversing gear, so that the driver in the cab, he has a balance when he's operating the reverser into the different notches. He's not fighting the entire weight of the valve gear. And there is our Walschaertz valve gear down between the frames. A lot fewer moving parts than you would expect necessarily on a 440. Quite a lot of our 440s in the collection at York and Shildon and elsewhere have Stevenson valve gear. This, being that bit later, has this Walschaertz valve gear, and it does give you a lot more space between the frames and much fewer moving parts, which helps with maintenance and it helps with cost, and it also helps with keeping the thing clean working between the frames. A few other bits and pieces that we can see, oil pots there dropping down onto the valve rod and onto the slide bars, and the top of the sand pot there with the lid that comes off. And there we are, that is Dunluce Castle, the nameplate there. It's really nice here at the Ulster Transport Museum because they have the nameplates from all the other U2s that were named after Irish castles as well, so that's a really nice feature. Although the locomotives don't survive, the plates do themselves. Look at this though, the detail here about how the firebox cladding is cut away to enable you access to the sandbox. Little features like that that just make these engines, make any engine worth looking at a little bit more. The washout plugs on the side of the firebox, and even this little handrail on the side of the cab, and there the crest of the London Midland Scottish Railway, reminding us that although we're in Northern Ireland, the railway is run by the LMS, but through the Northern Counties Committee and their offices in Belfast. So there we are from the platform. Let's go and have a look in the cab of the U2. Step on a steam train. Now here on the cab of Dunluce Castle, you can actually tell the difference that those extra inches make with the 5'3" over the standard gauge. It's that little bit wider, there's a bit more space in the cab. Yet it's a very basic layout here. We look at a lot of Loco cabs in our collection, and really there's not much different to say about this. There's our regulator handle. You step up for the driving position up here, so that you've got a view out through the front windows of the cab. Driver can sit if he wants to, head out the side, and he's watching for the signals and everything. There we are, past our LMS crest. That's quite a nice view, that there. But really, you know, the steam locomotive remains quite a basic machine. We talk about a regulator there. There's our little markings, open and shut. So the regulator pulls towards you from the driving position rather than pushing away, which sometimes is what you would expect. Our water gauge glass, duplicated, no glass on that one. The sander and the blower controls there. 2 backhead mounted Gresham and Craven injectors for getting the water into the boiler, and our lovely great Dreadnought vacuum ejector and brake valve here on the side, combined vacuum and steam brake, and then the reversing lever. Not necessarily the most ergonomic of designs, 1924, but so you know, the reverser's down here, you're driving up there, and you've got a sort of semi-driver's seat here. You move around a lot when you drive a steam engine. It's not necessarily somewhere where you're static and sitting in the seat, but little bits like a toolbox underneath the driver's seat there, and likewise another one here the fireman. Not that the fireman would take a lot of taking his ease, but he would get moments of having a break, so you can do that. Big hydrostatic lubricator here, the Detroit pattern, steam coming into it and the oil being atomised and put in through glycerin and then fed to different parts of the loco, and those are some of the pipes that you can see heading towards the front of the engine. A couple of gauges that we normally would expect. So what's up here is the vacuum gauge for the brakes, so the brakes are held off by a steam vacuum. There's our very long whistle valve heading up to the whistle just on top of the cab. You can just see the base of the whistle there, and then various steam valves on and off for the manifold and steam heating, and through to the lubricator, and then boiler pressure there, pounds per square inch, as we said before, with the LMS marking there, and then this one here I would imagine is the pressure gauge for the steam heating on the train. What else do we have? Shelf, all important shelf for putting your brew can on, and maybe a pie or something if you were sent home from home with something that needed warming. But you say put your brew can there. And then the firebox itself, very different approach to the firebox door. So we've got a flap that can be put up whilst firing, but this is a very different pattern of raising and lowering. And in fact, it doesn't shut the firebox door completely at all, so you've always got air going in, and you can only control that by raising and lowering the lower flap. So you can actually shut the firebox door, but it's a slightly more involved operation than just swinging a door open or sliding them from side to side, as we've seen on some of our other locos. Other bits and pieces that you expect to see on a boiler, things like the washout plugs there that are removed to allow for the engine to be washed out, the boiler to have impurities and things flushed through the system after a period of operation. And then turning round, there's our cab, a ventilator in the roof, and then round to the tender itself. There's our man putting his back into it, pushing coal forward, because of course on a long journey, you know, the coal is usually there. You fill the tender and it's all in this coal space, but as the journey progresses, the coal needs to be pushed forward from the back of the tender to the front, and that's what our man is at the back doing. He's pushing coal forward so that coal is still available down here at this shovel plate, so that instead of having, you know, it's a real nuisance if the coal's all at the back and you can't get any coal at the front. So if you get a water stop or somewhere where you're able at a station while picking up passengers, you can push the coal forward. But the tender itself, very basic. As we've said before, it's a coal carrier, it's a coal cart. So the coal is there, there's water in a big tank underneath that. We have a toolbox here, we have a handbrake here, and there's a water gauge just by Duncan's shoulder, just to tell you how much water is in the tender, just there. And that is basically that. It is a basic passenger engine of the 1920s. You could have seen something like this anywhere on Northern Counties Committee from 20 years previously. And of course these carried on for nearly 40 years after construction. Very basic, very simple, almost rudimentary, but very reliable, very popular, and engines that were very much enjoyed by their crews. Dunluce Castle is a unique survivor. Here it stands proud in the rail transport gallery of the Ulster Transport Museum, telling part of the story of how the mainland railways of Britain through the LMS and the Midland Railway took hold and controlled at a distance a railway system that carried millions of people for many, many years, stamping its own identity but allowing that little bit of regional expression as well, so that whilst this is an LMS locomotive, it's a Northern Counties Committee locomotive, which was run from the offices in Belfast. TransLink today run the railways of Northern Ireland, and it's fair to say that a lot of the operating practices are universal. Locomotive technology is universal. Railway operating, the single line tokens, all those details on it. It's variations on a theme, and it's lovely to see it here at Coulls. Thank you for joining us today for our look at Dunluce Castle. And our thanks especially are extended to our friends at the Ulster Transport Museum for their hospitality today. So why not come and join them? But also, if you've enjoyed what you've seen, like and subscribe so you don't miss out on future films from the National Railway Museum.